pet, particular pet philosophy of mine as an author, and I was actually talking about it on the Twilight Zone panel earlier today in respect to the legacy of Ron Serling. But I think one of the powers of, and one of the strengths of imaginative fiction, whether it's horror fiction or fantasy or science fiction, is using the imagination and using heightened reality as a way of illuminating human concerns. And if you write stories that are set on another planet or have monsters or aliens or what have you in them, and use them as filters for human concerns, that's powerful. And otherwise, it's not nearly as powerful, but they're powerful metaphors.
Now, the vampire, once it made its way into literature, is an archetype that evolves. And when somebody really kind of seizes onto it, like Stoker takes some elements from folklore and then puts his own spin on it and creates this very compelling being in Dracula. And so he changed and really established a lot of the things that we traditionally associate with the vampire, not being able to reflect into a mirror. That's totally Stoker. It comes from a conversation between him, Humpy Beg, and Oscar Wilde. Same conversation led to Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray, and is in a large part inspired by a real person, Henry Irving. But not to get sidetracked with that, Rice also is someone who was a game changer for the vampire. She took things, she added things to the archetype that at this point are so fully married to it that most of us may not even realize that it came from her. So Gabrielle, when she cuts her hair and she wakes up the next night and poof, the hair's right back. That idea of the vampire as a being in stasis. Not living, not dead, not a resurrected corpse, but almost an arrested identity. That's all Rice.
Yeah, very much so. And to go back to, just for a moment, the idea of rooting the imaginative in real life. I mean, we have to go back to the fact that the Vampire Chronicles began out of the death of a child. The death of Anne's child. So without that, we wouldn't have had her particular vision of the vampire, or if we had had it, it would have been with a different focus.
She borrows the vampiric embrace from what you see not as fully developed in Stoker, where Dracula visits Mina in her husband's bed with Jonathan like sleeping, just snoring through it. And you have this incredibly sexually charged scene where he grabs and opens his chest and makes Mina drink, like, what is it, the line is like forcing a kitten's face into a saucer of milk. Right. And then Rice takes the sexually charged aspect of that kind of vampirism as contagion, but also vampirism as a shared trait, and turns it into, again, another incredibly charged, this vampiric embrace.
I think one of the problems
for being live forever.
Yeah, one of the problems I see with a lot of current and upcoming people that are doing supernatural fiction, vampire fiction, without naming names, is they portray it too much as a love story and not so much of the darkness of the creature and the predatory nature, when for centuries that's all it truly was. It started out like the Nosferatu. You know,
it was like this Dragoi.
Right. I mean, we're becoming detached from the monster, being so focused on the beauty of the creature, when I think that Rice does the best job of blending those two aspects together.
I thought she did a remarkable job of that too. There's definitely the monstrous and definitely the sympathy.
Why don't we get like a little bit, because we've yapped on for a little bit.
I agree.
Again, without naming names, the thing that's always got me about more recent depictions is that there never seems to be any downside to being a vampire. That it's like, well, why wouldn't we all want to be vampires? That sounds awesome. And in Anne Rice, it's like, yeah, there's that arrested state of development, and there's like that denial of any kind of a peaceful end to any of it. And it's a bargain that you're making. You know, you get to be sexy and awesome, but also there's this terrible counterpart.
Right. There's pretty much the clear sense, at least from the perspective of a couple of her vampires, that their souls are in fact damned, that they have, I mean, the term Queen of the Damned doesn't come about by accident. That's the Catholicism that she wasn't practicing at the time certainly filtered itself into her version of the vampire mythology.
How much of the normalization of the mythos do you think is tied to attracting a younger audience? There's a lot of writing being done. Not all of it necessarily age appropriate, but it's being targeted towards the younger audience, and younger and younger and younger, and it seems to have made some writers sanitize what started
castrate
out.
their vampires.
Yeah, that was my gripe. It always has been. Maybe you know more knowing the people, but Charlene Harris and Stephanie Meyer's, their sagas, although I like True Blood much better than Twilight, obviously, I think both of them come across from the point of view that we don't know anything about vampires. We're just taking the generic archetype and going to put stories to it. They didn't do their homework the way Rice did, the way Chelsea did. You know, I think the newer authors are detached from tradition. Although I'm not trying to say you shouldn't, branch out into new areas and new types of genres, but I think we're missing something from the old days.
I think there's a sense in contemporary genre fiction, not just contemporary vampire fiction, but all of it that draws from a mythic undercurrent of watering down the mythology, homogenizing the mythology so that people don't have to feel like they're doing homework in order to understand the stuff they read. And I think that it does a disservice to the reader. It strips it of a richness that it would have if the reader could feel like they'd actually dug a little bit to get to it.
A lot of the allure of vampires, Rice's vampires and vampires prior to that, is the allure of the other. You see the same sort of psychosexual allure with the Phantom of the Opera, the outcast other, and in several other things, the Beast in Beauty and the Beast, especially when you get the Linda Hamilton version of it. What I have seen over the past couple of decades, and especially recently, all of our monsters have to be very human. And not just like conflicted human, but really our monsters are just us. Like we've almost become a little too conscious of the fact that the monsters are a projection, a psychological way of talking about how people are, and we've really just watered them down to a point where they're so relatable, they're really not monsters at all anymore.
We're not scared.
They're really just, that bad boy that you're having some conflicted feelings about dating because, he's kind of stalking you a little bit, but really he's also good in bed.
That could be anyone coming out of prison.
Who are you Wait, let me hear it.
Do we have another? Oh, right over here.
I think this one novel came out called The Strain. I think they did an excellent job just depicting the last thing you want to be is a vampire. I think The Strain, they did a good job in the anatomy of a vampire as a virus, how it slowly reprograms someone.
Yeah, and I think Del Toro was very conscious of trying to reclaim the monster.
Can y'all repeat the questions for us back here?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, you want to grab the next one, or you want?
Yeah. Go ahead,
Well,
Brian.
this question is actually for Michelle because
Okay.
you've made now 3 allusions to my favorite Anne Rice book, Cry to Heaven. So, talking about I just would like to hear you speak to the sense of the grotesquerie of the other, how you just, this is more just, can you vamp on that book because it's awesome. You said enough stuff about it. I'm like, this is, I love that book. So, and I'm stoked that other people love that book.
To me, the most potent appeal about any figure like the vampire in literature has everything to do with, if it hooks us on the sense that that little part of us that feels like an outcast, feels like it has been rejected by God and nature. To me, reading the vampire as it moved into literature, even beyond Cry to Heaven, the vampire is influenced by Byron, written by John William Polidori, influenced by Irving, written by Stoker. The boiling point of that conflict is here is something that looks like us, that was once us, and is now on the boundaries of our frame of reference. The whole point of a vampire as an undead entity, we borrow that from Eastern Orthodoxy. And let me go into the folklore a little bit. So our folkloric vampire comes from Eastern Europe. In Roman Catholicism, if someone dies and their body doesn't decay, they are declared a saint, because that is a sign of sacred purity. In Eastern Orthodoxy, which was a stronger influence for most of the countries, like Moldavia and all of that, and Transylvania, that give us the vampire as we understand it here now. And as people like Byron and Polidori were all drawing upon, in Eastern Orthodoxy, if a body did not decay, it was an indication that God and nature both rejected that person so completely that they were just cast out of the natural order of things. Which is why people initially were digging up bodies to see whether or not they had decayed. Was to see, well, once the body decayed, then the soul was truly released and moved on. And so at that core, that idea of being out of bounds, beyond the bounds, and not being able to get back in. And so you are a stranger looking in on a culture that you have an affinity for, and yet you never can fully connect again. And for many of us, and I think I can generalize, for many of us, there is a pathos in that character as people who may be too intelligent, too creative, too quirky, too whatever, to completely fit with what people expect us to be. And so that's really the resonance of that character for many of us.
And maybe that's what makes it so difficult for us to, in our time, see the vampire as truly monstrous, because we're so used to aligning the vampire with the outcast elements of our
I have a hard time seeing the vampire as some like little teen fashion model with mussy hair,
Yeah.
whose biggest problem is really his approach to a relationship.
Right.